Hi, I'm Benton Stokes.
And I'm Elane O'Rourke.
And this is Cocktail Theology.
So do you want a dog?
I don't currently need a dog, no.
Mm-hmm. I know that dogs are not your favorites. I know that you love our dog.
I do love Jack.
And I know that all in all, you prefer cats to dogs.
It's true.
I do too. Shh. But if you want a dog, or a duck, or a chicken, or really anything that's here, if you want to take it away so that I don't have to take care of it, or think about it, or tell it to sit, or tell it to bathe, or any of those things, that would be fine with me.
That would be okay with you?
Just today. Just today. Tomorrow I might be willing to keep... Yeah, probably not. Anyway, I would also want to thank you for sitting inside with me today.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Because, see, usually we love to sit outside.
We do.
But it is just wet and icky. And it's not wet because it's been raining. It's not wet because snow is melting.
No.
It's wet because the molecules of air are holding on to water.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just gross.
Yeah, it's hot and humid here in Tennessee.
So it is nice to be inside, and here we are. And our topic today is, I have so many feelings about this even before we start talking about it. But here's the topic. Is Christianity today, in our culture, our world, however you want to frame that, is Christianity doing more harm than good?
Yeah, that's a big question.
Now, I'm sure we have listeners who have thought Christianity always does more harm than good.
Sure.
And my answer to that is always, first hospitals, first schools.
Yep.
All of those things came out of Christian tradition. So Christianity clearly doesn't always do more harm than good. And religion doesn't always do more harm than good. But now, in the 21st century, with the federal government, at least in its most obvious forms, and particular Christian structures, and I'm thinking here about the political aspects of evangelicalism and fundamentalism and those, with the structure of the federal government and the structure of that branch of the church having come into such close communion, and having done that over the last 40 years, really, that alliance, in my view, and I think I'm not alone in this, has done more harm than good.
Yes.
And so what happens is when you have an alliance of empire and the church, whether it's in the 4th century or the 21st century, a lot of people get hurt because all the power winds up being distributed among all the people who are in charge.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I'm getting at my concern very clearly, but it's, maybe this is it. When what we think of as the spiritual foundations of life, and what we think of as the ruling bodies of life, are in connection, and particularly if they overlap, what we wind up with is either particular spiritual bodies dictating what happens in the government, or we wind up with concerns of power dictating what happens in spiritual life. I think that's the thing that's getting to me. And so the question is, so Christianity now, is it doing more harm than good in the United States?
Well, I think most of us who pursue faith earnestly, we'll say, would agree that the term Christian and the term evangelical even have been co-opted, and so the meanings, the nuances around those words for much of our American society, it's a very negative connotation. So when you're watching the news or you're reading the news and you're hearing about all the things that white evangelicals are doing, or all the things that white evangelicals support. And there's 100 polls that talk about how they voted, what they believe, what they support, where their money's going. And most of us, again, who pursue faith earnestly are going to look at that list and they're going to say, well, that list is not a list that I would expect to see next to a descriptor of Christian or next to a descriptor of evangelical, in the sense of these are not Christian ideas, Christian as in of Christ. These are not of Christ ideas. These are not of Christ practices. These are not things Jesus would support. So the term Christian has become less of a term that describes people who pursue Christ or have traits resembling Christ, and more of this is a voting bloc, this is a social group, this is a group of people who believe this certain way, and they ascribe their beliefs to something that they read in the Bible or something that they hold to some sort of tradition. But when you start really taking that apart and parsing that, many of those beliefs are not, in fact, things that Jesus would support.
As you know, it makes me nuts when somebody attempts to speak on behalf of an entire group.
Right.
So, the Christian worldview. Right?
Right.
The gay experience. The whatever. Just makes me insane. But I wonder whether part of what's happened is partly starting with the identity politics of the 1980s and 90s, but going into the way that media, in order to create catchy headlines or whatever, or for surveys, for that matter, for surveys, whether the collapse of categories into a named group, such as white Christians or white evangelicals. I wonder whether part of what's happened is that as people living in this time, we've lost our sense of nuance. And what I mean by that is this. If you had said Christian to me 40 years ago, there might have been a few different kinds of visions that would come up for me. You know, as somebody living in the United States, I might have thought of Orthodox people, people from Greece. I might have thought of Episcopals. I might have thought of Billy Graham. I might have thought of nuns. I might have thought of whatever. But part of what's happened over the last decades is all of that understanding of Christianity has gotten squished way down into this little tiny evangelical stream.
Yep.
And a very specific evangelical stream.
Yeah.
So I think when most people in the United States think Christian, they think evangelical. That's a problem.
Yeah.
Because Christianity is a global movement for good reasons and bad. It takes various forms in various places. You know, Desmond Tutu, who's one of the architects of South African liberation and theology and all of that, is a Christian, as is Billy Graham, or or Franklin Graham, better example, because boy, are they on opposite ends.
Right.
Like, that's all parts of the Christian worldviews. But in the United States, if somebody says Christian, we automatically think white evangelical. And I don't know if that's true in communities of color, whether they automatically think white evangelical if Christian is being said in a political context, but it wouldn't surprise me.
What good is blue if it's only blue? How could the sky ever feel new if you and I see nothing more? What then?
We were at Wild Goose not too long ago. That's a festival in North Carolina. And when we came back, we were talking to some friends who were expressing some kind of amazement over the welcoming breadth of Christians at Wild Goose. As if there were only one kind of Christian, and these particular Christians happen to be welcoming.
Oh, yeah.
You know what I'm saying? As opposed to there being a really wide variety of Christians.
Yeah.
All that to say, I think part of the problem with the language of Christian and Christianity in our time is when we, as a culture, hear Christian or hear Christianity, we don't think about Jesus at all. We don't think about Christ at all. What we think about is the people with voting power and electoral power and financial power in the United States.
Yeah.
I mean, if I walked up to a stranger on the street and said, "What do you think of Christians?" I think what they think of is the political band of a particular voting bloc.
Absolutely. Right now they would.
So, maybe part of the question is there any Christ left in Christianity?
Yeah.
I realize this is not a really happy conversation.
Yeah, but if what we are up against is our culture's understanding of what it means to be Christian, then that's something we need to look at.
Why?
Because the very definition of Christian means of Christ, or following Christ, or in the image of Christ. So if attributes of this particular group of people that are being labeled Christian are not of Christ, or don't reflect Christ, there's a problem. And then for those of us that don't want to be grouped with that particular group, it's difficult for us then to call ourselves Christian because they've co-opted the label and that label doesn't fit us. I feel very uncomfortable calling myself a Christian right now. I gave that tag up a while ago. And so the idea that other people, a lot of people, maybe the majority of people in the Christian church feel the way that I feel, then all of a sudden, yeah, that tag is not helpful.
Right.
I mean, it repels some of the people that I care very much about. You know, and one of the things that we saw that was so sweet about Wild Goose was how queer-friendly it was. And so you had people from an identifiable, ostracized by the church community being embraced by people of faith. And these are people of faith themselves.
Right.
So the label of Christian, that overarching label, is a label that would be repellent to some of those people. Even though they believe in Jesus, even though they believe in God, even though they have a deep abiding faith, they don't want to be called Christians, and they think Christians are kind of sucky. And with good reason.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of people like that. A lot of groups of people like that. So if I'm calling myself a Christian, how helpful is it for me to go to those people and say, I want to love you and I want to help you and I'm a Christian?
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, we've talked before about the fact that when I went to seminary, I lost my social circle.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But it was also very true for me that for a very long time, and I might even still feel this way. I'd have to think about it. But it was much more comfortable to call myself a pastor than a Christian. Because Christians are not nice.
They're not nice.
That doesn't mean that every Christian is not nice. But the loud Christians do not tend to be very nice. They're not very kind.
No.
The loud ones.
They're not. You're right.
Okay. So part of what we just got into is the name Christian. Part of it is the culture of Christianity. What do we who have an affinity for Jesus and are attached to God, what should we call ourselves? We have a problem with what it means to be one of those peoples. And we have a problem with what groups of those peoples, whether we are useful or not.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's start with the nomenclature thing. Okay? You don't call yourself a Christian much anymore, although you understand yourself to be in that historical tradition.
Of course,
and
yeah.
so forth. Okay. The problem with that is we're so used to that language, it's really hard to talk about what we believe without referring to that a little bit. For example, if I were to say I'm a Jesus follower, that might simply mean that I think Jesus was a great teacher.
Yeah, right.
And so I'm going to go be nice to people. If I say that I'm a Christ follower, problem with that is that distinction between Jesus and Christ is pretty iffy. And Christ doesn't necessarily mean Jesus of Nazareth, equally divine, equally human. Christ is simply a descriptor, right? Meaning Messiah or whatever. Or it can mean the cosmic Christ, the second member of the Trinity. If we say that we are people who live in the way of Jesus and who seek after God, that gets pretty specific, and there's some help in that, but it's really long.
Right.
Right?
Yeah, it's a hard way to introduce yourself.
Right? Hi there.
That won't fit on a business card.
It won't. I pattern my life after the way of Jesus, and I'm a seeker after God. and my name is Elane.
Right.
Yeah, it's not cocktail party, right? No. So there's the nomenclature piece. There's a piece that you alluded to without saying this, and it's who is a Christian?
Mm-hmm.
If somebody says, I believe in Christ, give me my ticket to heaven, is that person a Christian? Do we know that people are Christians by their love? Do we say that you are a Christian if you follow a particular biblical worldview that says men are designed for one thing, women are designed for another thing, and there it goes, and so I should stop talking now? You know, what does it mean to be a Christian?
Yeah, that can get really sticky.
And I'll just tell you, I don't feel really comfortable being the decider of who's a Christian and who isn't. Even though I have very, very clear ideas about it. I don't think that's my job.
Right. Well, what you just said, they'll know we are Christians by our love. I think that matters. I think if, as people who are seeking God in the way of Christ, if our actions reflect that, is it necessary that we call ourselves Christians? Is it necessary that we have the label? Or are we simply doing the work, loving people, serving people, and just doing it and letting the work speak for itself rather than having to tag ourselves or relate to some particular group? Because then, of course, there are Christians who like to sub-identify too.
Sure.
So they'll call themselves, Baptist or Presbyterians or Episcopalians or Pentecostals or evangelicals or...
Right. And that's denomination, that's tribe, right?
Is the tag necessary? Is the tag, as the question goes, is the tag helpful?
The argument that I gave my liberal church that had been raised up in the idea that you go and you do the good work, you do the political work, you feed the homeless, you do all of these things, all good.
Yep.
But you never, ever, 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 ever mention that you're a Christian because the work will speak for itself. The problem is, if people either have never heard of Christ or if there are people that Christians have abused, you need to say that you do this because you love Jesus.
Yes.
To both introduce that idea to somebody, and again, I'm not trying to get anybody converted, but introduce the idea, or to help change the way people think.
Yeah, sure.
So if I don't mention that I'm a Christian who feeds the poor, who picks up homeless people and takes them to hotels, if I don't mention that I'm a Christian, then their view of Christians winds up being only Franklin Graham or whomever, or Donald Trump.
Yeah, you're right.
So the problem with not saying it is we do nothing to change the terminology. And what it makes me think of, actually, since we're now talking about this, it reminds me when we in the liberal community, in particular in the LGBT community, started reclaiming the word queer.
Yeah.
And queer was a word that you didn't use. It was mean, it was hateful, it was uncomfortable, but we started reclaiming it and reusing it to re-energize it in order to use it as a generous identifier.
Yeah.
If we leave Christian to the mean, nasty people, it is an absolutely unredeemable word.
True. Unfortunately, the media is complicit in that too.
Absolutely.
So it's not just that Christians behaving badly are calling themselves Christians.
Right.
It's also that the media is calling them Christians.
Of course.
So we are getting inundated with the label Christian or evangelical. They're sort of interchangeable right now in the media, which is gross. But we're getting inundated.
Sure.
So overcoming it is not as simple as Bobby says he's a Christian and he behaves that way, but I'm also a Christian and I behave this way. It's more like the media is telling you, and you heard on the news 12 times today, that Christians are this. And I am one person, and I'm going to tell you that Christians are this.
This other thing.
This other thing.
Right.
It's not as easy as comparing one-to-one apples. It's like we're up against a gigantic force of negativity in the world. And we're trying to redeem a tag whose meaning and connotation is being reinforced globally in the media every day.
So maybe what winds up happening, bear with me here, maybe Christian winds up being a word we use among ourselves, the way that the N-word may be used among black people among themselves, but that we don't encourage its use outside of the community.
I could go for that, but then how does that settle the question of when we do something kind, hey, I'm a Christian?
Mm-hmm. Maybe instead we say something like, the reason I feed the hungry, the reason I vote this way, the reason is because I am a follower of Jesus, and I believe that's what Jesus would do.
Yeah.
Now, again, won't fit on a business card.
Right.
But maybe we create a more explanatory version of this.
It feels like I have to explain myself.
Right. Yeah. On the liberal end of Christianity in the United States, the common phrase is, so what are you? Well, I'm not that kind of Christian. Don't even say Christian. I'm not that kind of Christian. Which is icky.
It's icky that anybody would feel like they have to say that.
Right. But given where we are,
yeah.
Going back to the original question I posed, is Christianity doing more harm than good? Here's a distinction I think may be useful, although it's going to be really, really technical. I would say that Christianity, in the sense of faith and practice of a group of people aligned with Jesus of Nazareth, whom they call Christ, that sense, is quite different than Christendom. Christendom is the overarching structure or structures or organization that is the place of power for those people. Mm-hmm. So, Christians did not conquer during the Crusades. Christendom conquered during the Crusades.
Right.
Okay? Because the goal was not really to make everybody Christians. The goal was to bring people under Christendom.
Yeah.
So maybe the real issue, and again, this is a technical thing, maybe the issue is not, is Christianity doing more harm than good, but is Christendom doing more harm than good? And I would say Christendom always does more harm.
Right.
But we're just really aware of it now. What do you think?
Yeah. No, I would agree with that. I would agree with that completely.
And let me be clear about what I think is the more harm than good part. Mm-hmm. When Christ or God or Buddha or Allah or anyone, and your faith in that person or entity is being used as an excuse to do damage to other people, or to advance your own desires, or to limit the humanity of someone, or any of those things, that's bad. That's not about the practice of religion. Mm-mm. That's not about what your actual faith is. It's not about any of those things. What it is I want to destroy you or get you out of my way, and I'm going to blame it on this much bigger thing that you can't argue with. Right? Because if I want to hurt you, you can argue with me. If I want to hurt you and I blame it on God, what are you going to do?
What are you going to do?
Right? I mean, that's the problem here, is that in our country, Christ, Christianity, God, Trinity, whatever, is being pointed to as a way of justifying human bad behavior.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
That's the problem. Mm-hmm. It's like, when the Buddhists destroying the Rohingya and various other groups like that. I mean, it isn't just that Christians do damage. Lots of groups do damage and blame it on whatever their faith system is. Mm-hmm. And in our country, it's Christians. Mm-hmm. It's Christianity. It's Christendom. It is, I want to advance my own values. I want to have more than you have. I am afraid of people with brown skin, or whatever the thing is. And so, in order to have my way, I'm going to say, well, that's what God wants. That's what Christ wants. Yep. That's what Jesus wants, which is all nonsense.
Right.
And frankly, I think heretical.
Absolutely heretical.
I think it's blasphemy.
Yeah.
So the problem is, there's so many problems. I think it was Gandhi, or at least it's attributed to Gandhi, who said, I like your Christ, but I don't like your Christians.
Yes, I've heard that before.
Right? It's that. It's that human beings are a mess. Mm-hmm. And in our country, the worst human impulses are being justified with an appeal to Jesus of Nazareth, called Christ, called Messiah.
Yeah.
And so I kind of feel like, Christianity is doing more harm than good in this country at this time.
In this country at this time, I would agree with you. And it's making it really difficult, more difficult than it should ever have to be, for people to actually do the work of Christ in this country right now. Mm-hmm. Which is why when we go to a place like Wild Goose, for instance, and people are just throwing their hands up. They're like, what do we do with this? It's nuts.
When people have to point to the Dalai Lama to explain why they love people, that's a problem.
Yeah, it is.
Right? And I love the Dalai Lama, don't get me wrong. But if I, as a Jesus follower, in order to explain why I love people and why I make the decision to love people even when I don't like them, if I have to point to the Dalai Lama to find a position of peace, or Thich Nhat Hanh, or any of those people, if I have to point to them, I have fully misunderstood the message of Jesus and the point of Jesus, or that point of view has been stolen from me.
It's been stolen from us.
I don't want to give up that word to people who want to build a border wall. I don't want to give up that word to people who think it's okay to remove children from their parents because they had the misdemeanor of crossing over a border. I don't want to give up that word to people who want to take away the rights of women and children. I don't want to give up that word to people who think that black people are lesser or inferior or stupid or late, whatever. I don't want to give up that word.
No, I don't want to give up that word.
And it's not because I want to call myself Christian, because I don't. But it's because I don't want them taking over a word.
Right.
I mean, it makes me really angry to think that they think that that's their word.
They've made it their word.
Yeah. And it was a very strategic plan.
Sure was. Yeah. So these are very difficult times right now for people of faith who follow Jesus, who seek God in the way of Christ.
That's a good way to put it. I like that. Seek God in the way of Jesus.
In the way of Jesus. However, and you've pointed this out too, this could be a very good thing.
Say more.
Because some of us are seriously coalescing around what we really and truly believe.
Yes.
It's interesting because for the longest time, Christendom in America tried to portray itself as victimized, the war on Christmas and all that bullshit. They didn't have a voice. They didn't have a voice in government. They didn't have a voice in culture. They were getting run over by the gays and the blacks and the women.
Those gay black women.
All the other people. And now that they're in power, we see the way the country goes. And it's infuriating. But I think that on the other side of this, hopefully, many of us are learning what it really does mean to seek God in the way of Christ, in the way of Jesus. Hopefully, there are people who have been Christians in name, Christians that attended church on Sunday, who did a kind thing now and then, who are actually seeing the ugly of what's going on right now and saying, I don't want to be a part of that. It's like what our friend Doug Padgett said about Vote Common Good, going around to these parts of the country where it looks as though their congressional seats could flip, and convincing people, or not even convincing, giving people the opportunity to vote their conscience, whether that means voting for a Democrat instead of a Republican, or just not voting for a Republican, or writing in Common Good, or someone else. Hopefully what is happening, or what will be the result of some of this, is that what's left of the church will come out more convicted than ever of who we are and what Jesus would want us to do and what our responsibilities are in the world, what the Bible actually says about loving our neighbor, what it really means to be kind, what it really means to represent Christ and point folks to God. So when all this is over, there will be this big group of Christians that'll be utterly deflated, angry as hell, just like they were before this election. They won't be any less angry. And they'll continue to support whatever dumpster fire the Republican Party is going to be when this is all over. But I'm hoping that the rest of us will come out of this with a much clearer picture of what it means to be Christian. And I hope at that point we can start to take the name back in a way that other people can hear it and know what we actually mean.
So it sounds like we have to burn it down.
I think they're burning themselves down.
But I mean, maybe those of us who are seekers of God in the way of Jesus have to burn down Christian.
Yeah, maybe.
Who's ever known the power
that Christians in this country, this isn't the way you phrased it exactly, but Christians in this country have been complaining of being discriminated against and so forth. You know, that's a pretty recent phenomenon.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until Christians actually had all the power in the country, political power, and I mean Christians in the biggest scare quotes, white evangelical, it isn't even conservative, it's radically right voters, held most of the political power in the country, with some glaring exceptions. It wasn't until they held it and then were starting to lose it a little bit, right? They started talking about it as if they were discriminated against. Better, as if they were oppressed.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
Individual Christians may be discriminated against.
Yeah.
As a group, we are definitely not oppressed.
No.
At all. In any way. When you have no power, or not much power, you don't tend to think of yourself as oppressed unless somebody helps you understand what's happening. But when you have a lot of power and somebody takes a little bit away, if you're sitting in a room with Richie Rich Kid and you take away his toy, he's going to be all over you about taking away that toy. If you're sitting in a room with a kid who doesn't have many toys and has had them taken away before, frankly, you can take one away and they're like, well, of course I'm going to lose toys.
Yeah.
Neither of those is a good thing. But the whining over oppression by white Christians in this country makes me insane.
Yeah, give me a break.
No one is demanding that I take my cross off of my arm.
Nope.
No one is saying boo about building a church in a neighborhood unless it's violating, neighborhood ordinances. Right?
Right.
You build a mosque in a neighborhood, people are unfreaking glued.
Yup.
I don't know, man. I'm kind of leaning towards just dumping the whole word. I really am. Even though I would say that it's incredibly important for those of us who do things because we love God and do goodness because we love God.
Yeah, and I think you're right that we should point that out.
Oh, I just thought of something.
What?
Here's what it is. Here's the difference. Oh, I would love to do research on this. I wonder how many people who want to take away basic rights or whatever the thing is, that whatever we would consider negative. I wonder how many of them say they do it because they love God versus because God said so.
Oh, yeah.
Again, I'm imagining Franklin Graham. Okay, for those of you who don't know, I think Franklin Graham is among the least savory people in the United States at the moment. Anyway, I wonder if Franklin Graham ever thinks to himself, I want to send Mexicans, Central Americans, South Americans back to their country because I love God. Because I love God.
And how in the world would he ever arrive at that conclusion?
Well, right. There's something about the notion of love, and we've talked about this forever, that absolutely undermines that argument.
Yeah.
Right? Even when people say, hate the sin, love the sinner. Okay? Which, as we know, is crap. Right?
Yep.
Because if you can say that, you probably aren't really loving the sinner either. But there's something about the idea of actually loving God, actually wanting the best, actually being willing to put yourself on the line for the good of somebody, that sort of takes away the whole, and I'm going to basically, take your children away from you. Not for any reason except for the fact you stepped over this imaginary line. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah. I absolutely know what you mean.
I would love to hear from our listeners who treasure the name Christian for themselves, who really think of themselves as Christian, want to be known as Christian, and why they feel that way.
I would love to hear from them too.
Because I am sure I'm missing something. I have no doubt that I'm missing something. Today, I'm not sure what it is. Today, I'm kind of ticked off at Christendom and at people who call themselves Christian but directly undermine the well-being of others.
Yeah, me too.
Well, that was cheerful.
Sorry, guys. but I mean, these are things we got to think about, How do we reclaim a witness?
Or how do we just simply love on people without first alienating them?
Yeah.
Yeah, we would love to hear from you. any ideas, any thoughts, I would love to have a conversation about this, whether it's on our website or whether it's on your Facebook page or whether I don't know how we want to do that. I don't know, maybe we need to bring people together to talk about this, but I mean, I would have to say, in my view, Christianity, Christendom, is doing more harm than good in the United States at this point. Not individual Christians per se, but the organization, institution of human sin that is now called Christianity.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. And that's sad. It sucks.
Yeah.
Well, thanks you guys for listening to us
Rant
and consider these kinds of issues. And if you appreciate this type of conversation, this kind of challenging, thought-provoking stuff that we're doing, then hope that you will support us both with your comments and your encouragement, but also you can do that tangibly at our Patreon site, patreon.com/cocktail theology. It's where you can support us monthly with a financial gift. And you can also find us in all the social media places. I'm on Instagram a lot. Elane is on Twitter a lot. We are also there with School 4 Seekers. And Cocktail Theology is also on Twitter.
But we would love to hear from you. You mean a lot to us. And we aren't going to figure this out on our own. We need you to know how to be seekers after God in the way of Jesus in this world.
Yeah, we know we're not alone in the way that we feel right now. And you're not alone in the way you feel either. Mm-hmm. Let's keep this conversation going. Please. It's important stuff.
Please.
Thank you, always. Thank you for your support. We appreciate you and we support you in the things that you're doing and the things that you're thinking about. And may we all strive to love well and be kind to one another.
Amen.
Amen. Bye-bye.